welcome to the final session for today of Evidence Day. It's going to be a great session. So we're actually focusing on ecosystems for this session, the title of which is Building World-Class Ecosystems for Scale-Up and Growth Stage Companies. So this is very much looking at those in the audience that are ecosystem developers, policymakers, and other support providers that are working with scale-up and growth stage ventures on an ongoing basis. So what is it that we have to do, and how should we be building ecosystems that are fit for purpose when it comes to your local environment? So in terms of the description of the session, what are the global best practices for building world-class ecosystems for scale-up and growth companies? Whether you're a policymaker determining the best mix of policy instruments for growth and scale-up programming, or an academic looking at supporting the scale-up of companies founded by staff and studies, or a service provider, a practitioner designing and delivering pilot programs, we explore what the evidence says about building world-class ecosystems for scale-up and growth stage companies to scale economic prosperity and social vibrancy. Now, we actually have an active moderator for today's session, Dr. Catherine Graham, who's the Executive Director of the Impact Action Lab at Alberta Innovates. You would have heard about Catherine right at the beginning of the day, introduced by Doug Holtz, the AVP for Capital Development at Alberta Innovates. We're delighted to have Catherine moderating this particular session. She's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and co-founder of the International School on Research Impact Assessment. So Catherine specializes in performance and impact management for complex systems and brings a wealth of international experience and innovative practice to amplify community impact. So Catherine's experience very much is in ecosystems, how to understand the impact of ecosystems and really measure, but bring that thinking and design back into future programming. So without further ado, Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you, and I know you'll be introducing the panel. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Simon. We are the last session, but not least, and we have four fantastic panelists today, Viet, Ben, Risa, and Alba, and each one of them brings different diverse perspectives. As Simon said earlier this morning, Simon seems like a long time ago in terms of the policymaker and professor, practitioner, and provider. So, and we're going to hear those perspectives, particularly if we're really trying to build a world-class ecosystem and strengthen that ecosystem. So the cadence for the session will be, I'll introduce each speaker. Each speaker is going to present approximately 5 to 6 minutes. We'll do a moderated discussion, and please feel free to put any questions into the chat. So starting with Viet, he is the Acting Director of Policy and Research at the DIAS Toronto Metropolitan University. Viet applies quantitative methods to explore the intersection of technology, economy, and labor markets. He is a recognized queer leader and has authored impactful research on entrepreneurship and tech worker dynamics. So over to you, Viet.
No, thanks so much, Catherine. And I guess we're just jumping right into it. But I guess in starting, the reason why I was really excited for this panel is because oftentimes in discussions of scale-ups, people often confuse between so many different kinds of scale-ups, right? I think there are kinds of companies that grow their employee counts. There are kinds of companies that sort of continuously grow their capability to innovate. And then there are the kind of companies that manage to figure out how to sell lots and lots of products and great products that they own. And the reality of the matter is that all of those companies behave very, very differently. The kind of companies that grow the employee looks very different from the kind of companies that grow their revenue, for example. And so when it comes to creating policy support and ensuring that we have a really robust scale-up ecosystem in Canada, you have to start from asking the question of what kind of company are we looking to support? Is it a gazelle? Is it a unicorn? Or is it any number of these sort of real and fantastical creatures that might exist in this whole scale up zoo. And so thank you again, Catherine, and obviously Simon and team for the invite. And I'm excited to join the conversation today.
Thanks very much, Viet. Over to you, Ben. Ben is an associate professor of entrepreneurship at Babson College. His research focuses on how regional policies influence innovation and entrepreneurship. And Ben has extensive experience teaching and mentoring students and founders.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see if that ends in horror or not. There we are. So I'm really glad to be able to speak today because, as Viet mentioned, a lot of ecosystem development ends up being trying to chasing unicorns, these sort of billion-dollar private companies. And as anything involving chasing mythical creatures, there's a lot of myths involved and legends. But I think with ecosystem development now, we're reached a point where we actually have an evidence base, and we can start to figure out what works and what doesn't, and really separate out, what just someone happened to get lucky, a single event sort of setting off everything, into what are ideas that people can apply in different places. So in sort of my 5 minutes with you, what I really want to talk about is 4 big pernicious myths in ecosystem development and why these matter. So the first, and I'm really guilty of this, I'll admit I'm guilty of many of these myths as well, is that we have an over focus on new firms. The idea that an entrepreneurial ecosystem is all about helping create new firms that then grow like a rocket. But there's been some really great work recently that's looked at the growth trajectory of companies. And what we see is that this rapid linear growth is almost unheard of, except for the fact that we have heard of it because it's these one-off examples like Instagram or OpenAI. Most firms grow in an incremental or episodic way, so that they start off, they may go for a couple years of that much growth, something triggers that growth, they grow for a bit, then they stop and plateau for a while before more growth. So growth episodes are triggered by something. And for ecosystem developers, that's what matters, is how do we help firms trigger that growth? It could be a new emergence, a technological change, but also it could be a new founder vision. A founder realizing, hey, I've got to retire in 10 years. I better actually make some money. Or in family companies, a new generation coming in looking to make things their own way. So understanding those growth triggers is so much more important than just trying to create more companies and hope that some of them grow. The second myth, and I think we're pretty aware of this, though it really is sort of ingrained in us, is that we have this vision of the young university graduate as the ultimate founder. So again, we target universities, we target students, and we try to make them into high growth, high ambition entrepreneurs. But if you look at the data, the demographic that is most likely to be a successful founder is someone in their mid-40s who has been in their industry for more than 10 years and who hates their boss. These are people who have ambition, but they also have insights. They understand probably a niche industry, and they can see how to create value. So we're not necessarily looking at university graduates. We should be looking at middle managers, people who are, again, a decade into their career, have experience, have insights, and are looking to make a transition. So again, this is a totally different pool to focus on and draw on than, again, a lot of ecosystem development efforts typically are. The third, and I think this is the most pernicious myth, is that only tech firms grow. Almost every single ecosystem development effort, except some very special ones who sort of make themselves interesting by the fact that they're different, are aimed at tech firms of some variety. Deep tech, fintech, environment tech, green tech, whatever kind of tech you want. Most high growth firms aren't technology, or their competitive advantage does not come from technology. It comes from a unique insight about the market, about customer needs. And frankly, there's not a big correlation between R&D investment and the number of high growth firms in a sector. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to think beyond technology. What I always say is that restaurants are actually much better economic development engines. They employ more people, they have more local supply chains, and they're more likely to create spin-offs. So again, if you ask me if I'd rather have, if I'm an economic development fairy able to grant a wish to a region, can I give a software company with $10 million recurring revenue or a one-star Michelin restaurant? I do the Michelin every time because that's going to have more knock-on effects. And then the final myth, and actually the one I think is most important to talk about, is the myth that there's more high growth firms than ever before. This is false, and this is a huge issue. The rate of high growth entrepreneurship is stagnating in the US and in Canada and almost every other developed economy. There are fewer high growth firms now as a proportion of new firms created than there were in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. This is a big, big problem. There's a lot of arguments between economists about what's causing this. Some say it's because industries, markets are getting more complex. You need to be a big firm in order to succeed. But also, a lot of markets are now winner take most or winner take all. And companies are having bigger regulatory, technological, capital investment moats to prevent newcomers. So this is becoming an issue that is harder than ever to form and make a high growth firm. And this is something that almost no one is talking about. So to make sure I keep us to my 5 minutes and we all get out of here as soon as possible, I just wanted to have a really quick look at what does it mean to have an evidence-based ecosystem. And I think an evidence-based ecosystem is focused on firms rather than founders. This is about how do we make firms grow rather than how do we make high-growth entrepreneurs. And so this means that we're looking at a wider pool of people. We're not looking at young, cool tech firms. We're looking at really boring firms in industries you've never heard of before. We're trying to support that. And we're trying to broaden that base of support and figure out what are the different needs of different types of firms, different types of people at different stages of the firm's life and the founder's life. And so this really means looking at local specificities rather than trying to strengthen a generic tech economy. So I'll leave it there, and I'll really look forward to hearing what you have to think in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Ben. So Risa will be coming up next. She's going to speak from the perspective of a practitioner. And Risa John is the Director of Fund and Fellowship at Alberta Innovates. She's a background in strategy design for impact and ecosystem building. She's held senior consulting roles and has over 2 decades of experience in healthcare consulting. Over to you, Risa.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So I think I have the best job or role as practitioner because I get to take all of that evidence from the policymakers and the academics and put all of that into practice. So the example I'm going to use to talk about, significant strategies to make changes is a recent one around our Alberta Innovate Scale-Up and Growth Accelerator program. So as we've been talking about today through the many sessions, there's a scale-up gap. And so we set out 3 years ago to say, can we reduce that gap in Alberta? And starting off with the evidence base, we did about a 2-year environmental scan to say, what does the evidence say about leading practices around the world and the specific gaps in the Alberta ecosystem? How can we address that? And so based on that evidence, we came up with this ecosystem strategy. And I think that the first, kind of lessons learned is that to address an ecosystem problem, you need an ecosystem strategy. And so the strategy that we put forward or piloted has 2 pillars. One, it's the use of very strategically global accelerators in a managed process. And the second pillar is something that we call fellowship, the whole community and network wrapping around the entrepreneur. And so during the course of that pilot, we applied the learnings probably from the last 30 years about what are systemic strategies that you can apply to being successful by creating a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so in this slide, I'm going to highlight kind of 3 of the primary ones. The first is using an adaptive management model. And there are many adaptive management models out there, but the one that we applied is the Impact Action Lab's Performance and Impact Management Strategy, PIMS for short, and not to be confused with the beverage PIMS. And essentially that adaptive management strategy uses a holistic approach to designing and implementing strategies at an ecosystem level, starting off with environmental scans, using all of that good evidence, using that to inform your plan and how you would implement, ensuring that you bring in the culture at both an internal and an external level, having performance management and evaluation as a tool to constantly constantly improve and adapt that system. So if we think about this as a logic model, our input was using a very holistic adaptive management model. And then the second strategy that we applied is looking at, again, ecosystem change at a holistic level, and what are all the strategies or conditions you need to put in place to ensure that entrepreneurs will be successful. And we called that our growth play sets. So you've heard a lot, I think, today in other sessions about, instilling the right mindset for entrepreneurship at all of the levels of an ecosystem, ensuring you have the right team set. We just came off of a panel, around talent, ensuring you have the right tools. And so for us, it was accelerators as tools to help entrepreneurs scale and grow. And lastly, that impact set, how do we know that we're tracking and how can we improve? We embed that in. And then kind of the glue that I think holds all of those sets together is something we call fellowship. So really paying attention to the culture, community, and collaboration of the ecosystem. So those were our activities if we think about this as a logic model. And the output that we were trying to create is creating entrepreneurial capital. And again, recognizing when we think about this from an ecosystem strategy perspective, that it's not just about the economic capital. We need to also pay attention to the human capital, the talent, and building that. The social capital, the magic that networks and community can create. And lastly, the cultural capital of an ecosystem. So those were kind of our three key strategies that we applied. And because this was a learning system, and that would be the other strategy, we built in formative evaluations to say, are we on the right track? What can we learn? What can we improve? And so following along with kind of the myth busters, there were kind of three key myths that the realist formative impact assessment that Alba is going to be talking about a little bit more detail. One was, I like to say, it's the Silicon Valley works in Silicon Valley. It's about the whole kind of concept that you need to customize your tools to your ecosystem. And so we really looked at that with these accelerators, that they couldn't just take their Silicon Valley curriculum and apply it to Alberta. They needed to customize. And the fact that we can all leapfrog and learn from each other. And so that constant, feedback loop to make sure that we're looking and learning from other jurisdictions. The second was, it doesn't happen by magic or by one program. And I think if you're successful with an ecosystem strategy, people will think that you're sprinkling fairy dust. They don't realize that behind that is a really holistic whole approach and that adaptive management model behind the scenes that makes sure that you're constantly aware of what's happening in the ecosystem and tweaking and refining your approach. And the last is, it takes more than just throwing money at a founder for them to be successful at scaling and growing. It really takes an intentional fellowship approach to ensure that they're going to be successful. So those were some of the key myths that we learned. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about what I'm talking about, we just recently published the Formative Realist Impact Assessment, and there's a QR code there if you want to take a further reading pleasure. So back to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Risa. So I'm going to hand it over to Alba. Alba is going to give the perspective from a practitioner as well, but also in terms of provider consultancy. So Alba is a senior consultant in higher education research and innovation, Cirrus Academic. Alba specializes in higher education research and innovation. She excels in mediation and advising decision makers and is an active member of the Global Shapers community. Welcome, Alba.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So in my case, I'm going to talk about a very specific work that we did in collaboration with Alberta Innovates in the context of the impact evaluation that she was mentioning before. So we were in charge of looking at the world and trying to find some of the practices that in this case we call leading practice review, but that is actually one of the first lessons that we learned throughout the course of this work, that leading doesn't mean the same around all the places in the world. No, so we need to take what we call usually best practice, but then turn them into what is interesting about them for us, and adapt and rely on that customization that also Risa was pointing out. So that was one of the first point, and also a nuance that I want to share before the next points. Another element that was very interesting is realizing that even if we feel that we are talking, everybody's talking about the same type of policy interventions, we are not always doing so, and there is a matter also of wording. I won't enter into the fact of startup scale up, but at least this is a very interesting conversation that we had with Cecilia Vessinger from the Global Entrepreneurship Network, and I thought it was worth it to bring it to this table. So it was a little bit distinguishing what means building an ecosystem versus building a startup, and in this case, startup scale up. I will group them together, communities, no? And I think this points out always also back to the point that Viet Vu was making. No, ecosystem exist by themselves. They are there. They are part of our socioeconomical tissue, while communities are more intentional, also more exceptional, and not every company can belong to them because they have a specific characteristic that make them part of this group. So why is that important? Because policy interventions and this type of support that is provided differs completely. In the case of building ecosystems, we are trying to meet these companies at the point where they are and take them just one step further in the best direction possible. While when we are leading with startups, the truth is that we already expect them to be at a certain level. We expect them to have certain roadmap in mind and achieve certain level. No? So there are expectations involved there. That also changes what can happen, no? in each of the groups. In general ecosystems, there is more room for catalyzation and then allowing for emergence, while when we are addressing startup and scale-up communities, we are we need to assume that we are being a little bit more prescriptive about what we intend to do and which type of growth we are trying to achieve. And I think that helps also program managers and directors to understand what success means in each of these cases. And the truth is that when we are dealing with building ecosystems, success may look more broader when the type of indicators, more collective, and the type of indicators that we are looking at. When we are talking about a startup and scale-up communities, even if we may be talking about broader socioeconomic factors and indicators, they track back to individual performance. So it is true that we are trying to reach a certain high growth profile of companies. So this is also important in terms of how we measure our impact, how we talk to our companies, how we adapt our measures, and therefore how we tweak and learn at each stage of the process. A little bit more about the work that we did. We were focusing, that's why it was important to clarify the previous point, more in startup and scale-ups. So this is a map of the practice we reviewed around the world, and how we were looking into the world was also through the lenses, of course, of what was relevant for Alberta in this case. For example, regions or jurisdictions that have similar socioeconomic or demographic challenges or circumstances. Also some jurisdictions, for example, in the Rust Belt area, that were dealing with industrial transitions. Then also, just for a nice contrast, innovation hotspots that are, let's say, out of the playbook, as Israel or some program in South Korea. And then as this is a public program, we were looking into national public interventions and how they also interact with other programs, especially in Europe, and especially looking into Nordic programs, Nordic Europe programs, and the transition that they are doing towards digitalization. So this is a little bit an incentive to it. You still have the QR if you want to check more. And just as a final point, I want to guide you through the sort of insights that we can get from this sort of leading practice review. Here I have grouped them in three, let's say, topics. So the first 3 points, the first type of insights, are related to design choices in the programs, in the acceleration programs, but also in the program characteristics and the founding characteristic, no? That impact the business model, if it is a model that is subsidized, if it needs equity or not, and which affects sustainability also of the program, and what that impacts, and then the management model of publicly funded acceleration, if it is a public-private initiative, if you have everything in-house, outsourced, all these little layers of decision that impact the whole program and will impact how you reach your system. In the gray box, we see insights that are more related to other policy areas, so that they are in interaction with other aspects of the policy reality. Concretely, the aspects and the, let's say, tension or nice dynamic between attraction of global startups versus the choice of betting for growing and developing the local talent and the local companies through homegrown approaches. That was very interesting to see in the different jurisdictions. Another point is the connection with the domestic industry and how the companies that are supported adapt or not to domestic priorities or market needs versus the rest of the world. And finally, the light blue or light green box points towards 2 elements that in this case are components more related to some of the discussions that we were having with Risa, with Catherine, and the Albertan Innovates team, but we realized that they were also of importance in other parts of the world, which was how to support underrepresented communities in entrepreneurship, and especially in these kind of high-level communities as the startups and scale-ups can sometimes be, and how to measure and communicate added value and impact in a diversified way. So I will leave it here. As Risa said, you can dive into the report and we would very gladly have some feedback, and hopefully we'll have a chance to speak a little bit more about that. So back to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Alba, and just encouraging you to go into the chat if you have any questions for our panelists. And given that we're talking about building world-class ecosystems, we've heard from the different perspectives, and I'm going to now kind of do deep dive questions. I'm going to start with you, Viet, around impact and performance management. So in terms of how each of you measure the impact of initiatives and frameworks you use as part of this continuous improvement and learning. So Viet, for you, what are the latest trends in quantitative methods for assessing the impact of technology and innovation on labor markets?
Yeah, I'm happy to definitely talk about the impact, the measurement scheme, particularly as it impact technology and labor and everything. But I also definitely want to talk about the whole idea of scale-up ecosystem and the policies that you create and how you actually evaluate whether, let's say, a government policy is successful or not, right? And the way you do that is, again, start by having a very clear idea on how you are measuring scale-ups to begin with. And so this is a particular piece of study that I did with a colleague in the University of Toronto just about 2-3 years ago now, where we actually, our question was, we have all of these various different definitions of scale-ups, from employment growth to revenue growth to productivity growth. There are definitions that talk about consistently growing like 20% year on year for 3 years. There are also definitions that require you to pass a particular employment threshold. And so we actually wanted to test whether these definitions actually captured same kinds of firms or different kinds of firms? And the answer, as I think I alluded to in my quick sort of opening comments, was that they were not similar. They in fact behave quite a bit differently. And so from a measurement of success in scale-up support policies perspective, you have to get an understanding from the get-go of whether you're targeting the right kind of scale-up. So that's number one. Number two, particularly in terms of now talking about directly measuring success or failures of policy programs, particularly at least in economics, we have never actually been in a better time for this. Over the past sort of 3-4 decades or so, there has been what's called a sort of a causality revolution in economics, where scholars at universities and others, researchers, have really focused on being able to identify a causal impact of a particular policy, a particular change on behavior, on sort of macroeconomic dynamics and outcomes. And so we have all of these tools, from sort of randomized controlled trials to quasi-experimental tools that actually allow us to tease out not just correlation, but whether a particular policy actually caused change or not. And so from a methodological perspective, we're actually there. And then there's a third and fourth ingredient that's really, really, really key. Third is actually about convincing governments and policymakers to embrace this idea of evaluation from the get-go when they're designing the policy. We see too many cases in which, because of sort of political cost or even implementation cost, or sometimes just honestly resistant to this idea of scrutiny and evaluation, that a policy gets designed where, quite frankly, it becomes unevaluatable, because there isn't a good structure that is put on, or consistency in which how a policy is implemented. There isn't a particular set of criteria, let's say, isn't followed in who gets funding versus not. A particular way of developing and tracking outcome isn't there so that you can actually properly evaluate it. As an example, Statistics Canada, in a sort of collaboration with ISED, Innovation, Science, Economic Development, the big federal department, so Industry Canada, if you will, collaborated a number of years ago to create this really, really big and important database called BIGS, Business Innovation and Growth Support Programs, where they essentially put over 100 government support programs, federal government support programs, into a single database, particularly for researchers, because that database also links program recipients to essentially the tax filing data. So quite sensitive stuff that you actually have to get a security clearance in order to work with it. And then in the process of creating these sort of this database, they actually realized that there were a significant number of programs for which they couldn't actually figure out in a systematic way who the recipients were, because that just was not tracked or recorded in any way. And so that actually forced them to have to do that. And now it's in a pretty good shape. And researchers like myself, our colleagues, I'm sure Ben as well, are starting to dig into the potential of this database. But then there is the